And for me, the takeaway from early Mormon history, what my whole interest in this really is developed into, is we got to be really careful making the types of arguments we've been making, because we have this case of early Mormonism where there are these evolutions of ideas within, like you said, the same month the book came out. He's saying the opposite in what later becomes Doctrine and Covenants. I'm back with Dan Vogel, the greatest living historian of early Mormon history, and I don't think I'm exaggerating there. At least that's my view on it. So I want to respect people who are coming from a devout perspective, but I also want to hear what the truth is. And then I want to think about how this applies to other situations. For me, that's the bottom line. Yeah. How can I apply this? And I want to tell you one of the things, Dan, that I take away from this. We have all these ideas in biblical studies, Old Testament and New Testament, that are completely undermined by what happened in Mormonism. And I'll just give you an example. I have no doubt whatsoever that Joseph Smith Jr. wrote the Book of Mormon, that he created out of his own imagination, and that the Doctrine and Covenants were created out of his own imagination. Yet they sound like they were made by two different authors. One of them is, well, I mean, we started and we didn't get to it before the discussion about what it means, eternal damnation. Eternal damnation on its face in the Book of Mormon means if you don't have the right beliefs and do the right things, you're going to hell for eternity. But then in Doctrine and Covenants, he explains, no, it means you're going to be, or eternal punishment. You're going to be punished by the Eternal One, by God, and eventually you'll end up in some kind of heaven, right? So how could that be the same author? But it is, right? So
when so soon.
Yeah, within a few years, he's within a year even, he's given a different story.
That revelation you just quoted, is given the very month the book comes off the press.
That's amazing. So now when I look at a document and I say, oh, this is a real example, right? Yeah. I say, well, how could this have been written by Maimonides in the 12th century? Because Maimonides in his systematic theology says X, Y, Z. And you realize, well, okay, even though he was a systematic theologian, he's also a human being. And in some contexts, he's being systematic, and in other contexts, he's not. And that's really important for historical study of documents, not just the Bible, but for historical philology. We have this tendency, and I know you quote, and I want you to talk about this. There's a concept you talk here about, a certain fallacy. I forget what it's called. That people aren't really consistent.
Right. The idealist fallacy.
The idealist fallacy.
The idealist fallacy is that the human. You hold the ideal view of humans, and the ideal view of humans is that they're always consistent. And so you argue, well, Joseph Smith couldn't have said that because that contradicts what he said over here. And so you go, therefore, he didn't mean that. He meant something else. And then you try to spin it and try to harmonize. And my position is, well, that's an apologetic position, to demand that Joseph Smith never contradicted himself. He's always consistent. And to use consistency as the rationale for your very difficult interpretation to accept, therefore, like with Masonry, how could he be anti-Masonic in the Book of Mormon and then join Masonry in Nauvoo? So that's contradiction. So therefore, the Book of Mormon is not anti-Masonic.
Or it wasn't written by Joseph Smith. That's the other option, right?
Yeah,
maybe Sidney Rigdon was anti-Masonic, and he duped Joseph Smith, who actually, because that's one of the claims, that not only is Joseph Smith a Mason, but he came from a Masonic family, right? Isn't there a whole discussion about that?
His brother, we know, was a Mason.
So if his brother was a Mason, that means by implication, maybe he was a Mason. Yeah. How could he be anti-Masonic in the Book of Mormon? And it seems like he is, though. Secret combinations, you argue, refers to Masonry, right?
Yes.
Okay, so it's like and we didn't really get into the whole Masonry thing. Why was this such a big deal, Freemasonry in 18 in that time period?
1826. There's always been anti-Masons from the very beginning. I mean, when
Tell us about Morgan.
when Jefferson ran for president, it was anti-Illuminati, basically the
Okay.
same thing, a French version of Masonry. So there had always been anti-Masons around, but it really took fire when this gentleman named William Morgan, who lived in a town just east of Palmyra, he was going to publish the secrets of Masonry. And he eventually did after he died, but he was planning on it. The Masons got wind of it, and he got arrested on trumped up kind of charges and put in the Canandaigua jail, which is about 10 miles below Palmyra. And while in the jail, he disappeared from jail. Some Masons in a carriage drove up, yanked him out of the jail, put him in the carriage, and he rode off, and no one ever saw him ever again.
And the assumption is he was murdered by the Masons, right?
That's what everyone assumed, that he had been assassinated.
What do you think happened to him?
Yeah, I think that's what happened to him.
So he got Jeffrey Epstein.
There were trials, but some people that were involved only got light sentences, and so a governmental conspiracy theory started that they got off easy. They didn't have a body, of course, but they got off easy because the judges, the juries, they were all Masons, and they all gave each other a secret handshake or a secret word or sign or whatever, and they all stuck together and protected it, because that's part of the covenant is of Royal Archmasons, especially, is to protect one another no matter what circumstance. Murder and treason not accepted.
And it's my understanding, and someone correct me in the comments if I'm wrong, but it's my understanding in the United Kingdom today you can't be a judge if you're a Freemason.
I don't know.
That's what I've read. I don't know if it's still true.
There was a lot of anti-Masonry there as well.
Yeah. Well, it's also a fear that they're gonna be biased in their judgment of a court case based on that. So on the one hand, it sounds like insane conspiracy theories. Masons are murdering people. I met this guy who was a Mason, and he said, "Look, they're just a bunch of old, nice men who get together and play games." And
yeah, I'm sure.
And that might be true today, but if they're murdering people in the 1800s, then that's a different sort of thing.
Well, that was an isolated instance, they would say, and they would say that maybe the Canandaigua Lodge was, had apostatized from the troop.
So now we've got the idea of rogue Masons, which is that's what essentially Joseph Smith accused the Masons of being rogue against the true ancient, religion or customs, or isn't there something like that?
Well, that would be a Mormon apologist position, or
wasn't there something that
authors? There's a new book. There's a new book out recently that tries to argue Joseph Smith was always a Mason, that from birth his family wanted him to be the restorer of the pure Masonry.
Okay.
Which I don't follow any of this stuff.
Okay.
So,
all right.
So they would argue that because the Mormon temple is somewhat like the Masonic ceremony, or part of it.
And maybe was more so in the 19th century, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And so they try to argue that maybe that Masons are apostate. And Joseph Smith said in Nauvoo after he joined and borrowed their ceremony, Masonry is an apostate Mormon endowment, or an apostate. They're an apostate priesthood. So it's saying he bought into the notion that Masonic ceremony was handed down from Solomon's temple, and that was the ceremony and part of the ceremony in Solomon's temple that was handed down by the Masons and he restored it to its pure form.
So this statement of Joseph Smith that you just cited, is this a matter of dispute? Like, would Stoddard accept that Joseph Smith said that, or
About Masonry? Yes, it's
we don't know what Stoddard would say. What is this something that like was said by the enemies of Mormonism, or is this?
It was quoted by Heber C. Kimball.
Okay.
An apostle, Mormon apostle.
Okay.
He recalled it in while he was in Utah, and an apostle. Joseph Smith said that Masonry is an apostate endowment, and so did another guy, Benjamin Johnson, had a similar statement. And it's not disputed that Joseph Smith said that Masonry. Yeah. He's trying to explain that his ceremony that he gave, which is different. It's different than the Masonic ceremony. It's more religious, it's Mormonized. Put it that way. It's a Masonic Masonry Mormonized. So he was claiming to restore Solomon's Temple ceremony, and restore and purify Masonry at the time of his death.
So wow, that
creates a problem with, and so they would say that there is true Masonry, pure Masonry, and spurious Masonry.
That's what the apologists say, or Joseph Smith basically said.
That's what these new authors I just mentioned.
Okay, and what Joseph Smith was saying is that there was some true ancient ceremony from the time of Solomon that the Masons have corrupted.
No one really actually believes that. No critical person believes that Masonry was handed down from Solomon's Temple.
No, of course not. But Joseph Smith made that claim that that he's just restoring some ancient custom that they've corrupted.
Yeah.
Okay. And then the apologists want to say, oh, well, he didn't learn that in Nauvoo. He knew that from the time he was, I don't know, a child or something. Is that what they're trying to argue?
And the apologists would not argue that. That's a new interpretation that's going around on the internet now.
Right.
It's a book written about Joseph Smith and Masonry. They try to harmonize how Joseph Smith could join the Masons and be an anti-Mason in the Book of Mormon. And I say he's still an anti-Mason in Nauvoo because they're apostates.
So they're committing the idealist fallacy. They're committing the idealist fallacy, which frankly is something that, and I'm speaking here coming from philological studies, it's something people are doing all the time in my field, and they're doing it about things where they have no vested interest in their ideology or theology, right? Like I said, it could be something about what Maimonides or Saadia Gaon wrote in the Middle Ages, and you say, well, Saadia couldn't have written that because he wrote the opposite somewhere else, or maybe he contradicted himself.
I mean, it's something to point out. This is a problem, but you can't put too much stock in that kind of argument because humans contradict themselves. It's
kind of the bread and butter of some fields of historical philological studies. So, and for me, the takeaway from early Mormon history, what my whole interest in this really is developed into, is we got to be really careful making the types of arguments we've been making, because we have this case of early Mormonism where there are these evolutions of ideas within, like you said, the same month the book came out. He's saying the opposite in what later becomes Doctrine and Covenants.
The thing about that revelation is that the revelation itself says to not publish it, to keep it secret, and not to let people know that it's around contradicting the Book of Mormon. So if that's one of the reasons David Whitmer and others didn't want it published, because it said not to publish it. And the reason for that is the revelation itself gives the reason for not letting it out. Because
let's go back to explain to people what we're talking about, because that was an hour ago we talked about
the Book of Mormon is anti-universalist. It's against those who shall in the last days preach, I shall be beaten with a few stripes, but at last I shall enter into the kingdom of God, kind of a thing. That it's okay to sin, that all shall be forgiven, that kind of a thing. And there was a sect in the Book of Mormon time period, supposedly, called the Order of Nehor, who were universalists that the prophets pound on all the time. So, and then there's it predicts in the last days there'll be the same kind of people believing that you shall be saved no matter what you do. But the problem that the Book of Mormon worried about was that if you have that, no one will ever obey the commandments. There's no incentive to obey.
So you need the fear of hell, eternal hell, in order to be a good person, basically.
Yeah. So,
okay.
So Martin Harris is a universalist, and he believes in universal salvation. And it might be one reason he was starting to hesitate here for a second. So the revelation explains, and the revelation is given to Martin Harris, telling him not to covet his own property and to give it for the publication of the Book of Mormon, not to hold it. So before it says that, it says,
spoken like a true socialist, don't covet your own property.
Yeah.
Go on.
So it's told Martin Harris that it has been said in olden times that you should that eternal damnation and everlasting damnation, endless damnation, and it says that but it doesn't say that there shall be no end to that punishment. Which
the word eternal would imply that.
Well, then it says, "For eternal is my name." So eternal punishment is just saying God's punishment. It doesn't mean forever. It means the eternal, everlasting part is God. It's a noun. Okay?
Yeah. So it's
a noun. Yeah. God, eternal. God's name is eternal.
Right.
So it's God's punishment, but it's not eternal in the sense of duration. So
so is the phrase he's referring to, eternal punishment? Help me out. That's in the Book of Mormon?
Yeah, you should be able to find it. Eternal, everlasting. I don't know if the two words.
So, and he's all right. The Book of Jacob 7:18. And he spake plainly unto them that he had been deceived by the power of the devil, and he spake of hell and of eternity and of eternal punishment. And I'm not sure what the context. Let's see. Okay.
It also uses language of the Book of Revelation of the is the quake, the lake of fire, and shall be everlasting and things like that.
Okay, so what's so interesting to me about this is that the Book of Mormon is making sort of a big deal about how there's this heresy that needs to be combated, and it will appear in the last days. Meaning, it's Joseph Smith projecting about let's be concerned about these universalists, and yet when he has this revelation for Martin Harris, he's interpreting his own book in a way that's completely far-fetched. Yet he's the author of both the book and the interpretation, obviously.
The Revelation explains that.
Right.
That this language has been used so that it may work upon the hearts of the children of men.
Mm-hmm.
And not to let the revelation be known, not to publish the revelation.
Yeah.
Because the people need milk and not meat. And that they shall use it as an excuse and to their own punishment, their own damnation. So, in other words, what it's saying is that God uses misleading language on purpose. Mm-hmm. On purpose. Isn't it? Book of Mormon doesn't mean eternal damnation. It's using misleading language in order to deceive his children into obeying his commandments so that they'll be saved. Which they'll be saved anyway, but they'll be saved from a temporary hell. And the Revelation itself describes this temporary punishment. Even though it's temporary, it's something you want to avoid because it is so painful that it caused even I, God, it says, Jesus, I, God, Jesus, to tremble and to bleed at every pore in the Garden of Gethsemane, right?
This reminds me of a scene in The Sopranos where they're talking about purgatory, and the one guy says, "Oh, there's no, I'm not going to go to hell. I give all this money to the church." And he said, "I figure I'll do 6,000 years. I could do that time standing on my head." Right? So he's okay being this like degenerate murdering criminal because he thinks, "Oh, I'm not going to go to hell forever. It's just purgatory." I mean, they're Catholic, of course.
Yeah.
So Joseph Smith is explaining in this revelation, let people think it's eternal hellfire, or they might think it's okay to sin.
Right.
And he's attributing that to God. And so my point is that it sounds like a far-fetched interpretation of what's in the Book of Mormon, yet Joseph Smith is the author of both the Book of Mormon and the Revelation.
Yeah.
So, meaning I think he made them both up, in which case it really raises some issues, with, like I said, of historical philology. When you see a far-fetched interpretation, we would call this a drosh in Judaism. Here's an example where the drosh is the pshat, is the plain meaning, is the original intention of the author, that is to say, right? Unless he's just telling Martin Harris what he wants to hear. And then Joseph Smith really maybe does believe what's in the Book of Mormon about eternal punishment, but he doesn't want to lose Martin Harris or his money. Right now I'm attributing motivations that I don't have evidence for, right?
Well, the setting given to Martin Harris rather than somebody else, and the Revelation also talks about using his money to publish.
Don't covet your own money, yeah.
Not hold on to his farm. I mean, the situation is it applies very strongly that he's saying words that Martin Harris wants to hear. But
what does Joseph Smith believe? That's the question.
I use this as one of the evidences for my Pious Fraud thesis, and that's
talk about that. That's fascinating.
This is one of the evidences that Joseph Smith is portraying God as deceiving his children for a greater good, to help them avoid a temporary hell, anyway. Yeah. So he's laying at God's feet this notion of God sometimes deceives us, and religious and deception, deceiving for the greater good. You might, and I go to the Bible sometimes. I go to the Old Testament. I go to Jacob and Esau. I go to Jacob and Esau and how they deceived Isaac to give the blessing to the wrong son. Well, it
was the right son, just not the one that Isaac wanted to give it to.
Just not the one he thought he was giving it to. And it still
worked. At least that's the Israelite perspective, not the Edomite perspective.
Yeah. And it still worked.
Yeah, that's interesting.
God still honored it.
So here's an example from the Talmud, which later became a principle in rabbinical Judaism. And I'll just say up front, I'm biased because I'm not a rabbinical Jew, I'm a Karaite Jew, but that's beside the point. So the example is there are these two rabbis and they're traveling on the Sabbath, and one of them knows the correct, or just before the Sabbath they're traveling, one of the rabbis knows the correct practice of what they're supposed to do while they're traveling, because there are special rules when you're traveling just before Sabbath. So one of them knows what the correct ruling is, but he lies and attributes it to another rabbi. And then the Talmud comes along discussing this incident, and they say, well, we know that other rabbi didn't say it. Why did this rabbi attribute it to the other rabbi who's, a dead rabbi? And the answer is, well, how else would the other guy have accepted it from him? In other words, it's exactly Pious Fraud. He knows what he's saying. He believes what he's saying is true, but in order to get somebody else to accept what he's saying, he lies and attributes it to someone who didn't say it. Right? He attributes it to an authority, in that case, another rabbi,
Okay.
to say, well, this other rabbi says you're supposed to do X, Y, Z, knowing that was a lie, but the purpose of the lie was, well, I know I'm right, and how else will you accept it from me? So this later becomes a principle that's discussed in rabbinical Judaism, that and it's the question of, to what extent are you allowed to attribute something to someone who didn't say it in order to get people to accept your authority when you know something is true, you know the ruling is true. I would argue that the entire oral law is based on that, but that's the topic for a different discussion.
So
right? Meaning the opening,
what the ancient pseudepigraphists believed.
Absolutely, that's what the pseudepigraphists believed. And I'll just finish this example of the oral law. So the opening passage of the Mishnah says that the oral law was revealed to Moses on Mount Sinai, and he transmitted it to Joshua, and Joshua to there's a chain of transmission, right? Did the rabbis who said that really believe that? Maybe yes, maybe no. Maybe they just said that because they said, how else will people accept it if we don't attribute it to Moses? Now, where do I get that from? And I don't know if I want to go into too much detail, but there's a story in the Talmud about Moses is in heaven, and he sees God doing something mysterious, and he says, why are you doing that? He's tying crowns upon the letters, whatever that means. And God then puts Moses forward in time into the time of Rabbi Akiva. And Rabbi Akiva is maybe the first time travel story in history, I'm not sure. And Moses hears Rabbi Akiva teaching something completely nonsensical and ridiculous. And people challenge Akiva, and they say, where'd you get this, Akiva? And they even call him Akiva Bar Joseph, right? They're being very familiar with him. And he says, it was revealed to Moses on Mount Sinai. And the point of the story is, Akiva made something up and attributed it to Moses, but it was still what God intended, even though he knew he didn't hear it from Moses. It was, in a sense, revealed to Akiva, and because Akiva believed it was revealed to him, he was allowed to falsely attribute it to Moses, because God intended it. And that it's a very complex theology, right? But it really is the pious fraud concept. And they're telling you, in a sense, this is my interpretation of the story in the Talmud, they're telling you, in a sense, that every rabbi knows he's doing this, and it's legitimate. So there is this, and so is Joseph Smith doing that? I don't know. I can't read his mind, but you're arguing he is doing that. That he knows that he didn't see these words on the stone, but he worked it out in his heart, and he had a burning feeling that it was true, and therefore he was able to attribute it to God. That's basically weird. Okay.
He does believe it's from God. Just not in that manner.
Yeah, and the rabbi who says this was revealed to Moses on Mount Sinai believes it was revealed to Moses on Mount Sinai, even that's not where he heard it from. He made it up.
Yeah.
But he believes it must have been revealed to Moses on Mount Sinai. How else would I know this?
Yes.
And the way they express that in the Talmud is they say, even that which a student asks his rabbi was revealed to Moses on Mount Sinai. Well, I mean, the student made up the question. What are you talking about? Well, yeah, it was revealed to that student, and therefore it must have also been revealed to Moses on Mount Sinai. So there's this whole theology of attributing something to Moses that nobody believes they heard from Moses. They know they made it up because 5 minutes ago they didn't know it and they'd never heard it before. But they can attribute it to Moses because of this complex theology. Things were revealed to Moses that even Moses didn't know. And I know that's off the topic of Mormonism, but to me it's uncanny, the parallel there of pious fraud. So anyway,
that's a term that they used in the 19th century. The deists called the Book of Deuteronomy a pious fraud.
Right. So they claim that it was made up by Ezra, you say, and I know there's people today who would say who would argue it was made up in the time of Josiah by Hilkiah. It doesn't matter. Right. Anyway. So I found the earliest use in the English language, what I think is the earliest use of pious fraud. Okay. And it goes back to the early Reformation, where they were talking about the people who were the Catholic monks who were creating, what do you call those? Indulgences. They were selling indulgences, and they knew, this is the accusation of the reformists, of the reformers. They knew there's nothing about the indulgent that gets people out of sin. It's the Catholic priest who just, I don't know the exact theology, but something to the effect of the Catholic priest, he absolves you of the sin, but he needs money for the church, so he can charge you for it and tell you that paying for the indulgence gets you out of the sin. Right? So you can look it up. That pious fraud was used in the early Reformation to refer to the indulgences. And they're not saying it in a positive way. They're saying, this is why we need the Reformation, because the Catholics were doing this.
I say that Joseph Smith, like the pseudepigraphists, needed authority. He's just a farm boy. What does he know about theology and things? But he believes he's right. He's prayed about it. He's gotten confirmation from God about it. How does he get someone else to believe it?
Right.
And he wants to fulfill God's will, and that takes other people to do it. And so, he starts out with this Book of Mormon, moves into church, then moves in as he's writing the Book of Mormon. It's a total institution thing where he's going to set up the kingdom of God on earth.
And we'll go back to that just to end here. Although I want to bring a quick example of pseudepigrapha that wouldn't be controversial even to anybody, which is, you have in the Second Temple period, Jews writing all kinds of works, like the Book of Jubilees, which claims to be an angel that's revealing things to Moses on Mount Sinai. Well, there are no Jews certainly today who believe that the Book of Jubilees was revealed to Moses on Mount Sinai by an angel, right? So everybody pretty much accepts that that's falsely attributed to Moses in order to give it authority. Even the most devout Jew today would believe that. And the same thing, so another example is the Book of Zohar, which some Jews today would say was the revelations of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Many Orthodox Jews and all historians, anybody from a critical perspective, would say it was made up in the 13th century by a rabbi who, in order to give it authority, attributed it to a Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai in the 2nd century. Why Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai? Because he was known as a mystic. So attribute it to somebody who has this mystical authority, even though it was written 11 or 1200 years later. So just to end here, it's your contention that Joseph Smith wanted to establish, or at a certain point, at least in his career, wanted to establish a theocratic government in the United States. Talk to us about that. Let's end on that note. That's really fascinating.
What about it?
So just explain that concept. Like, where do you get that from? That he wanted to establish a theocracy?
Well, the theocracy, I mean, it's a lot of people in the past history have wanted to set up theocracies, like the Anabaptists in Europe. Even the Puritans came to America believing that America was the New Jerusalem, the seat of the New Jerusalem. So it's a concept that Joseph Smith inherited from his Puritan ancestors. Now, why it was in America? So he tries to make America relevant to God's prophecies. And he wasn't the first one to do that either. I mean, like I said, the Puritans saw themselves as the new Israel in America, and that they were setting up a New Jerusalem. They tried to have a theocracy here in America. Then other Puritans like Roger Williams and others started saying that they didn't have authority to set up a New Jerusalem or to restore the true.
And you mean they didn't have the religious authority, right? We're not talking about from the king.
Right. They left that behind. They left England and all that problem of Church of England and all that behind when they came to America, because they were being persecuted there in England. So they came here and they wanted to set up a theocratic government, and they did. And they kind of went a little astray here and there with the witches and all that, but
that didn't work out well for a lot of people. Yeah.
So there is that dream, that strain of thinking from Joseph Smith's ancestors up to his time, and he read the Bible. He was a literalist. He believed that God would restore Israel. He believed first the mound builder myth and the Indians coming from Jerusalem or Israel, the 10 tribes. It was mostly the 10 tribes came from Israel to America, and the Indians are ancestors of the 10 tribes. That was a theological solution to how did the Indians get here? Who are they?
Yeah.
Are they even related to Adam? You know, do they have souls? You know,
Wow.
to be saved, you know, or should we just destroy them and take their land? And a group of evangelical types, different religious types, started believing that the Indians were the lost 10 tribes of Israel. And one reason why they wanted to argue that was that it would fulfill Bible prophecy of restoring Israel, and that they're worth saving, that if you convert the Indian, which you should be spending a lot of your energy converting instead of destroying the Indians, you will fulfill Bible prophecy and hasten the second coming. You know,
That's interesting.
This is how they thought.
Okay.
So they were trying to save the Indians from being destroyed by suggesting that they were the 10 tribes of Israel. And there were people that believed they came from Asia all along. They were kind of became the minority. Most people mostly turned to the Bible, like maybe it was the Tower of Babel. They were spread throughout the world, Genesis says. And then the next obvious thing was the Apocrypha, and the book of Esdras talked about the 10 tribes of Israel being led, eastward to a land where never mankind dwelt. And that became America.
Okay.
And so they ran with that, and Joseph Smith picked up on it, and he thought that would be a great way of converting the Indians, telling them that they're really Israelites and that they're fulfilling Bible prophecy. And
do you think he believed that, or is that again it's the Pious Fraud idea. He believed it, but it was also a strategy to advance his agenda, in a sense.
Yes, he had ambitions beyond. I would argue that he had narcissistic tendencies as a charismatic leader himself, and he shows signs of having narcissism. Don't know how, psychological that became, whether it was an actual disorder or not, personality disorder or not. I would not go that far. But he has narcissistic tendencies and grandiose ideas. And so he saw himself as the great prophet of the latter days that would set up the kingdom for Jesus to come to, the New Jerusalem. The Lord would come into his temple in the New Jerusalem, and they would be there to meet him. They would be caught up in the air, this rapture kind of thing, concept that a lot of Christians have. And then the millennium will begin.
Okay.
So
he was proclaimed king. Let's end with that. Shortly before he was assassinated, wasn't there a council of 50 that proclaimed him king?
Yeah, he set up a secret council of 50. It was made of Mormons and non-Mormons that were trying to help him in his bid for the United States presidency, actually. And they were part of what they were doing was looking for a new place of settlement.
So he was running for president when he was assassinated.
Yeah, how serious he was is not sure. Sidney Rigdon was the vice president candidate.
I mean, we recently had a president elected that nobody thought was serious either. So
yeah,
who's to say?
Yeah.
No, I mean, nobody thought. I shouldn't say nobody. Very few people thought. Let's say in the mainstream media, for sure, very few people thought President Trump would ever be elected. Yet he was.
True.
So who's to say that Joseph Smith wouldn't have been elected? I don't know.
Well,
anything's possible.
In that day is, he had some things going for him.
He definitely could have taken
Other
Illinois.
people did not have for. He had a whole missionary program that could spread his pamphlet. He had a presidential platform, my views on the whatever, and the missionaries would spread that all around. So yeah, he was running for president, and he gave various solutions for the problems of his day. On slavery was to give them their own state.
Okay, that's interesting. I don't know that anybody else has suggested that, or in the period had suggested that. This has been a fascinating conversation, Dan. Definitely kind of a first for me to talk about, a topic that I wish I knew a lot more about, and hopefully I'll learn more about. I've already learned more about it just from talking to you. Well, I want to say one final thing, and then I'll let you say some final closing remarks. If you're watching this, listening to this, and you have the burning feeling in your heart that, tells you Joseph Smith is a true prophet and the Book of Mormon is true, far be it for me to tell you that that's not the case. I was trying to have this conversation I'm not a believer as Mormons would define it. And so I want to understand what happened and how, more importantly for me, how I can apply that to other situations. And I think I've learned a lot from this process. Dan, any final words?
Oh, it's great being with you today. I've just recently become aware of your show. I must say that I have a lot of Jewish relatives. My wife is Jewish.
Oh, wow.
she's a Christian now.
Okay.
And I'm nothing.
Kind of like the Nephites, right? The story in the Book of Mormon is that and we didn't even really talk about this, is that you had these Jews who came to believe in Jesus even hundreds of years before he came, and so that's and I was kind of making a joke there, but there is an interesting Jesus believing Jews according to the Book of Mormon. In some respects, the Book of Mormon is what you would have expected to find in the Old Testament if Christianity is true. In other words, you have people openly saying hundreds of years before Jesus that God's is coming soon, and he's going to come down to earth, right? Meaning that's the way that Isaiah is interpreted, but it's explicitly stated in the Book of Mormon. By Christians. So I think that's really interesting. Anyway, thanks so much for all your time.
Thanks for having me.
I hope we are able to broadcast all of this. We've been recording at this point, guys. I think this is a personal record for me. We've been recording for I want to say almost like 7.5 hours or something like that. So thanks so much.
All right.
Shalom. Goodbye. Thank you. Shalom to your wife.
Sure.
You have been listening to Hebrew Voices with Nehemia Gordon. Thank you for supporting Nehemia's McCore Hebrew Foundation. Learn more at nehemiaswall.com.